In the north of Mönchengladbach in western Germany, it is quiet, almost idyllic. The city center is not far. There are small restaurants, playgrounds, and many green spaces. But in the spring of 2017, there is also something that no one notices. Not for several months. A dead boy sits in a tree, a tall yew. He's only 17 years old when he dies. And for weeks and months, his body lies in a treetop without residents or walkers noticing him. How could Mark's life end like this? Mark grew up in Mönchengladbach with his parents and 3 siblings. The family lived in an apartment building. From the outside, Mark seems like a perfectly normal boy. He likes cartoons like SpongeBob and is a fan of Spider-Man, is interested in American cars and loves climbing. Behind closed doors, however, things look different. Unfortunately, there are some problems within the family. Mark's mother is paralyzed down one side after a stroke and needs a lot of help in her daily life. She gets this from her son, Mark. At the time, he's only 14 years old and is confronted with problems that would push many adults to their limits. Mark's father is an alcoholic and prone to violent outbursts. This makes the responsibility on the teenager's shoulders all the more difficult. The Youth Welfare Office is aware of the difficult circumstances in the family. One of Mark's older siblings was taken out of the family as early as the mid-1990s. He remained in state care until he came of age and had no further contact with his parents or siblings. In January 2014, Mark's parents still have problems with their children living at home. Mark's little sister in particular is rebelling. She's only 12 years old, but sometimes spends her free time with much older men, including adults. This is a major concern for the family. That is why the parents contacted a counseling center to seek help. There it was noticed that Mark's father is actually subject to a restraining order with regard to the family. The mother had obtained it herself by reporting her husband to the police. However, she withdrew the report the very next day. When asked, both spouses stated that everything was fine. Background: Mark's mother went to the police on January 12, 2014. On that day, she told the police for the first time that her husband repeatedly beat her. She also said that her husband had already murdered another person. After these statements, an order for Mark's father to stay away from the family actually took effect on January 13, 2014. This order also prohibits him from entering the shared apartment, for example. However, the mother rescinds this order just one day later. And just 1 week later, the 2 spouses went to the counseling center again to get help with the children. At this appointment, Mark's mother is said to have said that she simply cannot do without her husband. According to reports, the father is said to have repeatedly become violent towards his wife nonetheless. When drunk, he repeatedly beat her. The father's behavior was also otherwise problematic. Several times he was seen walking the streets at night with an iron bar, damaging cars. The neighbors of the S family are said to have even started a petition to force the family to move out. Mark's father is said to have repeatedly made racist comments and shouted right-wing slogans through the streets. He's said to have once threatened to hit a neighbor in the face because her baby cried too loudly and he felt disturbed by it. The police are also called time and again. However, neighbors report that there have never been any consequences. The officers would talk to Mark's father, and then there would be a brief period of calm. But sooner or later, the noise and the harassment would start up again. After one of these police visits in January 2014, he shouted that the next time it wouldn't just be the police at the door, but a hearse. And unfortunately, Mark's father was proved right. A few days after the visit to the advice center, the family's problems escalate further. On the evening of January 23, 2014, the parents have an argument. According to media reports, it was again about Mark's little sister. It is said that she had a boyfriend who was 16 years old and had an immigrant background. The latter fact in particular did not suit Mark's father. He then blamed the mother, accusing her of not being able to assert herself against her 12-year-old daughter. After the argument, the father goes to the nearby off-license to buy a few beers, which he drinks with friends at the War Memorial Cemetery in Rheindahlen. After that, he sets off back home. However, he spends the night in the cellar that evening. There's an old couch there on which he occasionally sleeps when arguments have escalated, and he does not want to stay in the shared apartment. In the evening, he drinks another bottle of Geneva and a bottle of wine there. Mark's mother has a doctor's appointment the next morning. Mark, who was 14 at the time, wants to accompany her to the practice. Outside the front door, the two are intercepted by the father, who stops mother and son from going to the doctor. Mark's mother immediately asks her son to close the door again, but the 14-year-old first tries to mediate. He tries to de-escalate the situation and says that his father wouldn't do anything and can quietly come back in. But in the apartment, the argument turns physical. Mark's mother tells his father that she no longer loves him. She then flees to the bedroom, whereupon her husband follows her and grabs a knife in the kitchen. And then the unthinkable happens. He begins stabbing his wife, a total of 33 times. Mark, who is only 14 years old, pushes himself between them to protect his mother. He manages to knock the knife out of his father's hand. But Mark's father goes back into the kitchen and gets a second knife. He now attacks not only his wife, but also his son, who is standing protectively in front of his mother. Mark is stabbed twice, so severely that his lung is punctured and he loses a lot of blood. Nevertheless, Mark manages to escape from the apartment and ask for help. He screams, "Help! My father is going to kill my mother." And unfortunately, the 14-year-old boy was right. Unfortunately, Mark's mother received help too late. She died at the age of 50, brutally stabbed to death by her own husband. Mark himself only just survived his father's attack thanks to emergency surgery. The 14-year-old spent a lot of time in a clinic. After that, he and his two younger siblings were placed in a home. Mark's father was arrested by the police at the scene and was also seriously injured. He was shot by the police during the arrest. After being treated, he was remanded in custody on a charge of manslaughter. On August 4, 2014, a trial started for the murder of his wife and attempted murder of his son Mark, as well as for assault and abusive charges. During the investigation, the police became aware of a case from the 80s that had disappeared from the radar of the authorities. Mark's father had already been convicted of a crime once, when he was 20 years old. At the time, he attacked his 17-year-old ex-girlfriend with a knife when she broke up with him. The girl was stabbed 10 times and only barely survived. However, the entry had since become time-barred. The files were destroyed. As a result, Mark's father is not considered to have a criminal record when the charges are filed in 2014. The public prosecutor's office demands a life sentence. However, the criminal court assesses the father as an emotionally disturbed hothead. In addition, he had about 2.3 per meal alcohol in his blood at the time of the crime. Since the act was committed in the heat of the moment and the perpetrator was intoxicated, the murder charge fails. Instead, Mark's father is convicted of manslaughter. Accordingly, he's not sentenced to life imprisonment, but to 12 years. Mark, who was 14 at the time, is entitled to 35,000 euros in compensation for pain and suffering as a result of the attack. However, Mark's father never served his full prison sentence. He died in prison in 2015, 1 year after the verdict. Some sources say he committed suicide, while others claim he died a natural death. We don't know which is true. What we do know, however, is that Mark and his siblings were left as orphans. And life continues to throw them, and Mark in particular, more and more obstacles. Mark is severely traumatized by the attack as a result of his father. He is diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. Such a disorder manifests itself as a kind of delayed psychological reaction to an extremely stressful event. Typical symptoms of PTSD include flashbacks, anxiety attacks, sleep disorders, and nightmares. In addition, there are so-called avoidance symptoms such as a lack of energy and indifference. It is hard to imagine what must have been going through the mind of Mark, who is only 14 years old during this time. Although Mark is a rather quiet boy, it is said in the children's home that he was often conspicuous and freaked out after his father's death. Once, during an argument, he had reached for a knife out of fear to protect himself. The teenager becomes more and more isolated. At the same time, his little sister is put into a different group, and so he loses regular contact with her as well. It is said that Mark cannot be treated and does not want to talk about the trauma he has experienced. He repeatedly runs away from the children's home and spends the night outside. He finds it difficult to stand closed rooms, probably a consequence of his trauma. Closed doors or windows make him nervous, and he feels safer in the open air. He can usually be found in the Windberg district of Mönchengladbach, sleeping on roofs or in trees. Residents often see him roaming the neighborhood with his hood pulled down over his face. He doesn't seek contact with others and keeps to himself. In April 2015, Mark was admitted to the psychiatric ward for 2 nights. For a boy who panics in closed spaces and experiences a loss of control, this must have been a difficult experience. While the Youth Welfare Service would have liked to have Mark permanently admitted to a psychiatric hospital, this was opposed by the latter. Mark could not be admitted as an inpatient because there was no acute danger to himself or others. Furthermore, his admission would mean an extreme deprivation of liberty. And that could be counterproductive, especially in Mark's case. So Mark is not admitted to the psychiatric ward. At some point, Mark is banned from entering the children's home. According to documents from the city of Mönchengladbach, the placement can no longer be continued. Unfortunately, we do not know what the exact reason for this is. But from that point on, Mark lived on the streets. From time to time, supervisors and street workers took care of him, but only from time to time. During this time, Mark turned to drugs. To get money for them and for food, Mark committed a few thefts. He stole food and also from a fashion factory. There he steals clothes for his little sister. The two see each other only very rarely, but once he brings her a stolen bag as a gift. In 2016, he's briefly detained in juvenile custody for his thefts. He was released on the condition that he seek out and maintain contact with an educational outpatient clinic. But Mark didn't do that. He is now 17 years old and still living on the streets. In December 2016 and January 2017, there are a total of 17 appointments for him at a psychiatric clinic. But Mark doesn't show up for a single one. Every now and then, a few street workers still have contact with Mark. But even these relationships end at some point. The teenager blocks out all help. The thought of being in a closed space like a children's home triggers him. So he continues to live on the streets and usually sleeps in trees. Mark was last seen by a caregiver in January 2017. This caregiver discovered one of Mark's hiding places on the flat roof of the local health department. Mark occasionally spends the night there. The employees bring him blankets or a warm jacket when they see the young man there to protect him from the cold. Occasionally, they also bring him something to eat. But Mark is also secretive with the health department employees. When the supervisor discovers Mark's hiding place on the roof, he calls the police. He probably hopes to finally be able to confront Mark and persuade him to accept help. The children's home where Mark lived is just a few meters away from the health department. But when the police and his supervisor arrive, Mark manages to escape. He seems to have no desire to return to a youth welfare facility. On April 29, 2017, a man contacts the police in Mönchengladbach. While out for a walk, he noticed a large doll hanging in a tree. The old yew tree is very close to the health department and the children's home. When the police arrive, however, they discover that it is not a doll that is in the tree. It is a mummified corpse. The dead body is lying in the treetops at a height of about 4 meters. The autopsy will clarify the identity of the dead man. As you might already have guessed, it is Mark S., who was only 17 years old. It is no longer possible to determine the cause of death because the decomposition process is already too far advanced. It is assumed that Mark died in January 2017, either from freezing to death or from an overdose. The only thing that can be ruled out is third-party negligence. Mark must have been sitting in the crown of the old yew tree for over 3 months. Every day, walkers, residents, maybe even old acquaintances walked under the branches of the tree. But no one seems to have looked up closely enough to see Mark in the tree. After his autopsy, Mark is buried in a communal grave with his mother. Fates like Mark's may be rare, but that doesn't make them any less real. After his father killed his own mother and almost killed him too, Mark was left to fend for himself. At a much too young age, with a much too heavy burden on his shoulders. I wish Mark's remaining relatives and the people who knew him a lot of strength and all the best. Maybe this video can be a reminder for all of us to keep our eyes open around us and to pay attention to what our fellow human beings need. Sometimes a lot can be achieved with a sympathetic ear and trust. Take good care of yourselves and each other. And that brings us to the end of today's somewhat different video. Feel free to write me in the comments on how you like videos of this kind. In the end, of course, it's about a criminal case, but the young Mark S. is the focus here. The tragic story of him. I'm looking forward to your opinion. Otherwise, there's not much more to say, except that I would be happy if you would leave a like, comment, and/or subscription. And activate the bell, because this way the video gets a lot of interaction shortly after the upload and increases the likelihood that the video will be suggested to people who have not yet subscribed to Insolito. Thank you very much in advance and thank you for watching. I wish you a good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on when you watch the video. And I hope we'll see each other again in the next video. Until then, ciao everyone.